Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for the release of our task force report on the climate crisis and global migration. We're delighted to be hosting this event. My name is Eric Schwartz, and I'm president of Refugees International. On February 4th, President Biden issued an executive order on rebuilding and enhancing programs to resettle refugees and planning for the impact of climate change on migration. Section 6 of the EO directs the National Security Advisor to deliver a report to the President by next month that includes, and I quote, options for protection and resettlement of individuals displaced directly or indirectly from climate change, end quote, as well as options for policy measures on a range of related goals. So, inspired by this directive, Refugees International convened a task force of distinguished stakeholders with particular experience and deep knowledge on these and related issues. I first want to both list and thank members of our task force. Nisha Agarwal, the Deputy Executive Director of the International Refugee Assistance Project, or IRAP, Alex Alenikov, the former UN Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, Brian Atwood, the former USAID Administrator, Ruben Brigardy, the former US Representative to the African Union, and now President of the University of the South, Elizabeth Ferris, Research Professor at Georgetown University and Task Force Co-Chair, Lauren Herza-Rizi, the Director of the Environmental Change and Security Program at the Wilson Center, Mark Hetfield, the President of HIAS, the Reverend Mary Catherine Moore, the President of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, Kaylee Ober, Senior Advocate and Program Manager of the Climate Displacement Program at Refugees International, Maria Otero, the former Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, Ann Richard, the former Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration, Rick Santos, the President of Church World Service, Alex Disherbinin, a Senior Research Scientist and Associate Director for Science Applications at Columbia University, Maureen White, the former Senior Advisor on Humanitarian Issues in the Office of the Special Representative to Afghanistan and Pakistan. And if I've omitted anyone, Beth Ferris will remind me, but I think that's all the members of the task force. So the United States has a special responsibility here. And the task force reported that there is conclusive evidence that climate change is already influencing human mobility. Estimates of those who will be forced to migrate vary widely and will be impacted by policy decisions made today. But whether in Haiti, Honduras, Bangladesh, Burkina Faso, and thousands of communities around the world, there's little doubt that tens of millions of people will be displaced over the next 2 to 3 decades, due in large measure by disaster and other environmental changes affected by climate, with the majority displaced within the borders of their own countries. And again, the United States has a special responsibility here to lead on issues of climate change, migration, and displacement. And while projections of climate-related migration, and this is an important point, they're sobering, but they're not beyond the capacity of governments and the international community to address effectively and humanely. A global challenge of this proportion requires a commensurate set of responsibilities. Thus, around reduction of risks that result in displacement, the task force urges a historical and substantial increase in support for disaster risk reduction and support for an international global risk reduction and resilience fund. An increase of similar dimension in the administration's commitment to climate adaptation programs, targeted assistance to those most impacted by climate change, and a much stronger commitment to support and empower local communities on the front lines of this issue around the world. In the areas of displacement, of protection, of migration pathways, the task force has recommended also options designed to meet this challenge, including US government recognition that those forced to migrate due to climate change are in many cases likely to face risks of return that would amount to persecution. systems of complementary protection in the United States for those who may not meet the refugee definition, but who are unable to return safely due to dire threats, including from disasters exacerbated by climate change. Legislative strengthening of temporary protected status and strengthening of deferred enforced departure. A range of measures to strengthen protections for those displaced internally due to climate change. The development of a U.S. approach on planned relocation and enhanced global coordination on climate-related migration and displacement. In sum, predictions about climate migration, as I said, are sobering, but they're not beyond the capacity of governments and the international community to address effectively and humanely. And we hope that this report will contribute to the overall effort to promote the will and the capacity to achieve this outcome. I want to thank all the members of the task force, my co-chair, Elizabeth Ferris, our project director, Kaylee Ober, the staff at Refugees International, and the other organizations played a critical role in this work. And finally, I would be remiss if I did not offer a word of thanks to one of my predecessors, Ken Bacon, whose vision as president of Refugees International, whose vision on the importance of this set of issues led to our own climate and displacement program. So today we will hear from task force members, Alex Desher-Binnen, Beth Ferris, Kaylee Ober, and Rick Santos, whom I've already briefly identified. So with that, I would like to turn the floor to Alex Desher-Binnen. Alex?
Thanks so much, Eric. Let me start by saying that it has been a great honor to be part of this task force. As a scientist, I'm not often invited to the policy table, and it's been a great opportunity to be part of this process. My major area of research is climate-induced migration, which is the study of the ways in which climate factors, from gradual changes in temperature and sea level to more abrupt changes such as cyclones, forest fires, and floods, affect migration and displacement of populations. So there's ample evidence from multiple sources that climate impacts are having discernible effects on migration patterns and trends. These range from careful statistical analyses of migration in relation to climate variables to field-based studies involving surveys and focus groups of vulnerable communities whose livelihoods and living conditions are under threat owing to major shifts in the climate system. There's also ample evidence of displacement from extreme events, such as the back-to-back hurricanes Ida and Iota that struck Honduras last November, or Hurricane Dorian, which flooded major areas of the Bahamas in September 2019. Even in the US, we increasingly see displacement from major floods and fires, so this is not a surprise to those of us on this call. It was important to state that at the current time, climate impacts are one of a multitude of factors that figure into migration decision-making by would-be migrants. Often, climate factors operate only indirectly and may be subsumed under broader economic motivations, such as escaping poverty. Economic research shows that a single major hurricane, for example, can not only wipe out accumulated assets for a family, but also set back GDP growth in affected countries by up to a decade. Governance factors, crime, and instability in countries of origin also play a major role in shaping migrants' perceptions of the costs and the benefits of remaining in place versus moving to someplace new. But as the atmosphere warms and as rare events become more common, climate factors are likely to rise in importance. In work that my center at Columbia University completed with the World Bank in 2018, released as the Groundswell Report, we estimated that there could be up to 143 million climate migrants by the year 2050 in 3 major regions: Latin America, Africa, and South Asia. While any projections are going to be imprecise, this work demonstrated that based on the climate sensitivity of past shifts in population distribution, these levels of migration were at least plausible in the absence of major efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions. So planning for these flows becomes not only a policy, but a moral imperative. Most people want to stay in their home countries, and migration is the exception rather than the rule. And research shows that a variety of strategies are already being undertaken by farmers, pastoralists, and fisherfolk to adapt to the changing environment. We have an opportunity to both assist those who wish to adapt in place, while also acknowledging that migration is an important means of adaptation and that migrant remittances can help support those who are left behind. That is why the task force recommendations are so important. Thank you very much again, and I appreciate the opportunity of being able to serve on this task force.
Thank you, Alex. And now we'll turn to Rick Santos.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Alex. Just to really follow on what Alex was talking about, I'm Rick Santos, the president and CEO of Church World Service. We're a 75-year-old faith-based organization working with communities around the world to respond to hunger, poverty, displacement, and disaster. And there's much congruence with between the recommendations in this task force report and a study that we did this year on climate impacted communities. Our study was basically around with over 200 interviewees, one-on-one, 26 focus groups, 30 communities across 5 countries, Cambodia, Georgia, Haiti, Indonesia, and Kenya. We wanted to learn about how perceptions of climate change are related to decisions around adaptation and migration, and to try to understand what people were thinking. Also to better understand our own programs and how we could reflect the diverse needs and emerging demands. And finally, how livelihood adaptation and disaster risk reduction in climate impacted communities could be done better. The study that we did, Church World Service did, affirmed that climate change is very much on the minds of people in these communities and is felt in their daily lives. Whether it be impacts on agriculture and rural livelihoods and on disaster risks, we heard how climate change is one factor in migration, though not the only factor. We also heard that in some communities, like the ones we work in Cambodia and Haiti, many people described migration as a way of coping with slow onset changes, such as increasingly unpredictable rainfall and water scarcity. In other places, in communities that we work in rural Kenya, migration was not widely seen as a coping strategy, in part because of the perceptions that it has high costs and uncertain return. Across the board, we heard a strong desire for in-place climate adaptation to succeed and to reduce the risk of displacement. 6 main points from our study came through. Simply, improve access to water. So second would be support climate resilient agriculture. The third was increase access to community-based finance and affordable working capital. To support, fourth was support disaster risk reduction and long-term disaster recovery, and encourage community participation in both. The fifth was increase resources available to communities where people already feel climate pressures acutely. And finally, mobilize climate action at the national and global levels. These recommendations from our study are the kinds of long-term investments in adaptation and resilience that recognize that staying in increasingly harsh climatic conditions is a difficult choice. And this choice will only become more difficult as climate impacts continue to worsen. All of these are very consistent with the task force report that we're sharing with you today. The task force report asks for increases in funding for disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation programming, targeted development assistance, and calls on the grand bargain floor of 25% of all support to go through local mechanisms and affected communities. We have seen, especially in health, in bilateral and multilateral space, some very good and some very bad approaches to local communities and civil society involvement. And frankly, personally, I feel that we will not be successful unless we can move in this direction and find a way to bring local communities to the table of decision-making and implementation. And therefore, we and I call on the administration to increase support for adaptation and ensure civil society and local communities are included. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rick. And now I will turn with thanks for her work on this project to Kelly Ober, a member of the task force and our project director. Kelly.
Thank you, Eric. So as Rick alluded to, the report makes the case that not only is the amount of financing crucial, but the ability for it to reach those who need it most is as well. So therefore, the task force focuses on the issue of localization in its recommendations for a variety of reasons. For one, as Rick noted, there is a dedicated movement to localized funding, which acknowledges that local actors must be a part of the decision-making process and money managing process. The Grand Bargain pledged 25% of humanitarian assistance to local level actors, but assessments just this year at the 5-year mark show that we haven't hit that mark. But this isn't just a Grand Bargain failure. Reporting shows that less than 10% of climate financing makes it to the local level too. And a little over 8% of USAID funding makes it to the local level, despite a pledge of 30% made by then Administrator Raj Shah in 2010. So the second reason why localization is so important is the business case to do so is strong. Local communities understand their context better and address their problems at lower cost and greater speed. And as Alex alluded to and Rick's research shows, climate change's impacts on migration outcomes are highly contextual. As such, it makes logical sense to invest in local communities to figure out what makes sense for their own context for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation measures, and for planning for migration. The report believes that the Biden administration has a responsibility to adhere to the Grand Bargain and pass USAID pledges to localized financing. We recommend that USAID should commit to a target date for reaching its 2010 objective to direct 30% of its annual grants and contracts to local partners. We also make the case for contributing to smaller international funds that explicitly focus on locally led climate change adaptation, like the Adaptation Fund. For instance, a 100 million year infusion to the Adaptation Fund would go a long way. But even with these efforts, the reality is that climate change will continue to affect human mobility in a variety of ways, which require a whole other set of policy solutions. So Beth will speak more on that.
And I think that's my cue to invite the task force co-chair, Beth Ferris, to finish up, and then we will. We're already starting to get questions, and we'll spend the rest of the time with those. But Beth, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you very much for the opportunity to co-chair this distinguished group of people working on climate migration. And what a wonderful opportunity to have the U.S. administration ask for suggestions to compile a report on this issue. It's the first time we've seen this, and I think we all took it very, very seriously. We know that the scale of migration is likely to be large in the future, though, as Alex said, we don't have a good grasp on the total numbers that will happen. And we know that movement is always multi-causal, that rich people have different options, faced with exactly the same environmental conditions. We also know that migration is a tried and true protection strategy since the beginning of recorded history for dealing with environmental hardships. So as you said, Eric, in your introduction, the statistics and forecasts are sobering, and yet this is not an unmanageable crisis. We have time to act and to plan and to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. And all of our recommendations are geared to that. I note that most of those who move because of the effects of climate change are likely to be internally displaced. The 143 million that Alex mentioned are internal climate migrants, according to the World Bank study, and that's a worst case scenario. But dealing with internal displacement is different than changing immigration policies or refugee policies for the relatively limited number of people who are likely to move cross-border. So we include some recommendations to support governments to plan for this, to think about it. You know, where are people going to move? When are they going to move? Are communities prepared to receive them? And we know that this is not just an issue for people in distant, poor countries, but it's also happening in the United States right now. There are efforts, for example, to planned relocation to retreat from coastal areas or from areas at high environmental risk. And U.S. communities, just like communities in the Pacific and Latin America and the Middle East, are all struggling with, how do we get this right? And so we offer some concrete suggestions for doing that, as well as some suggestions for using some of our existing immigration means to respond to this, to use existing labor migration pathways, for example, or to tweak temporary protected status. Finally, we also know that at the international level, a lot of work is being done on these issues, but a lot of it is done in different silos. You know, there are climate folks and migration people and refugee people, all with their own approaches. And so we suggest strengthening this multilateral to create a platform for bringing these different actors together, perhaps building on the platform for disaster displacement, which I think has done some brilliant work at looking at cross-border disaster displacement. So Eric, there's a lot to be done, but these are exciting times as we think about how to approach this challenging issue of climate migration. We can't wait to hear all of your questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Rick, Alex, Kaylee. We're going to now open it up for questions. I'm already receiving questions. And I think the first one, and what we'll do is I will raise the question, and occasionally I will suggest one of the panelists give a shot at an answer. But I think sometimes I will direct. And in this case, I'm going to direct. So the first question we have is as follows. Half of my family is from the nation of Kiribati. My father's village has been under the ocean for over a decade. We are predicted to be one of the first nations wiped off the face of the earth. We do not want to leave, but we also have nowhere to go. We are in company with other countries in the region. And what has the international community done for our villages and nations? We see little adaptation mitigation efforts on the ground, but we hear a lot of people talking about us. So I'm going to invite Kaylee over to offer first comments on this question, because I know these are issues that has occupied a fair amount of her time and attention. And then we'll invite other members of the panel as well. Kaylee?
Thanks, Michael. A really prescient question. This is speaking to what Rick and Alex were also speaking to, which is communities are already grappling with climate change. It's not some sort of, it's very tangible now and very existential, right? And so, you know, this report recognizes, one, that we must try to invest in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation as much as possible so that these kinds of, you know, worst case scenarios don't come to pass. And I would say that's an effort for the international community to really focus on, because that's where mitigation ambition really lies. And so it's very important we address that issue. But at the same time, it's important that, you know, financing makes it to Kiribati, to the villages that you are related to, that you have connections to. So you really see that money come to fruition and allow people that you know to adapt to a changing climate. But even still, there are irreversible climate change impacts that Kiribati will face, and really is a leader in addressing these issues through things like migration with dignity. So basically upskilling citizens to be able to move as freely as possible and with their own agency to other countries like Australia or New Zealand to work to be able to build resilience back home as well. I know Beth has worked quite a bit in Kiribati's planned relocation efforts as well. And so I'll also punt to Beth to speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the situation of Pacific Islands is particularly dire given the reality of sea level rise. And, you know, the reality is that most of these islands are going to become uninhabitable long before they're submerged, just as the water supply is contaminated and so forth. You know, and so thinking about planned relocation cross-border is terribly painful. And the Pacific does not have a very good history of this, with the British moving people and with very bad results for the most part during the colonial era. But to look, you know, creatively at what are the options. New Zealand has done some interesting things using some of its labor migration pathways. You know, are there other ways that the international community could be supported if, and I would say, and probably when, people from Kiribati have to move. I remember years ago talking to a pastor from Kiribati who told me, with literally tears rolling down his cheeks, saying, I know there's no future for my family here. I know that. I can't leave. This is my home. But I'm sending my son to school in Australia and hoping he can find a job and find a future and settle down there, because there's no future for him here. I mean, these are dire things we're talking about.
Would any of the other panelists care to comment? If not, we'll just move on. Okay. So this is a question where everyone will have their own opinion, because when you have a task force report, and there was a remarkable degree of unanimity in this task force, I have to tell you. But still, different people have different notions of what their priorities would be. So here's the question. I'm going to open it up to the panel. What are the top priorities or advocacy actions to urgently address climate displacement? And this is one I'm just going to throw to the group, and whoever would like to start, the floor is yours. And if nobody starts, I'll say something. But I'm eager to hear the members of the panel.
So maybe I'll jump in, Eric. I think one of the top priorities has to be around disaster risk reduction, and how we as organizations work with local communities in addressing essentially their vulnerability. So, this has been essentially a perennial issue for development agencies for decade upon decade. But I think with the climate change issues today, that this is becoming more acute, and we can't wait 10 years to figure this out. So for me, having a clear level of support for DRR activities is really important. And then I'd say the second thing is, most people don't want to leave. They don't want to leave their homes. I think Beth gave a great story of a situation as dire probably as you can find, yet that the person wanted to stay in their own home. And so for me, I also think that strategies and support, funding, resources that can actually help people stay where they are, or at least give them the ability to make a more informed choice is really critical moving forward. Thanks.
Alex.
Yeah, I'd add to what Rick said. Climate change adaptation strategies have the potential, as I mentioned or alluded to in my remarks, to allow communities to stay in place. I think that we need, I'll just make a plea. I think we need to look at this from a moral perspective, that we as the United States has emitted something like 25% of global emissions and only has 5% of the world's population. Historically, we have a huge moral obligation to help those who have been affected by the economic prosperity that's been engendered by the burning of fossil fuels in our country. So I just want to get that out there. But I think that kind of support for community-led adaptation activities is important, but I also want to mention that there will be continued internal migration and facilitating migration in different ways, and facilitating integration in, say, urban areas in developing countries, and also facilitating migration where possible to safe havens, as was mentioned in the case of Kiribati. These countries, need to have safe havens and places where they can migrate to. These are all going to be critical elements of any kind of foreign assistance package. Thank you.
Yes, Beth.
Yeah, and I think you can do two things at one time. You can do everything possible to prevent people from moving, but also be prepared if and when it happens. Just like for a disaster, you try to reduce the risk of fires, but you also have strong firefighters and plans to evacuate people. So I think we need to really follow this two-track approach.
Thank you. The only thing I would add to that is there is quite a detailed set of comments and recommendations on the issue of internal displacement in the report, to which I refer everyone. And then the other comment I would make is, in terms of the localization issue, that was such a major focus of the report and the discussion in the task force, and it's reflected in the report. There are several, we've got a lot of questions. We're not going to get to all of them, I don't think, and some of them are overlapping. So I'm going to do my best to try to, to incorporate as many as possible. There's one, Congress, and I might take a first stab at this if I may. Congress looms as a barrier to Biden's climate agenda. How dependent are you on the recommendations on congressional action? And I will offer some preliminary thoughts about this, and then I'll invite task force members of the panel to add. First of all, a lot is dependent on the Congress, but let's put this, not all, but a lot, and let's put this into perspective in a couple of ways. Number one, Congress has not been a significant obstacle, to my knowledge, to US expenditures on disaster risk reduction. And Congress has been a reasonably reliable supporter of international humanitarian assistance. And if you added up all of our prevention-related recommendations in the DRR and the climate change adaptation, right now, foreign aid is about 1% or less of the US budget. International humanitarian assistance is far less than that. Our recommendations for historical increases in this area would not change those percentages. And at most, back to the envelope estimate, if the administration and Congress approved everything that we recommended on the prevention side, you're probably talking about a 5% increase in international humanitarian assistance, but far less with respect to foreign assistance. So the congressional issue, some of the dimensions of that congressional issue, I don't think are going to be politically overwhelming. I just don't. I think there will be, I think on some of the migration recommendations, those will, be part of the politics of migration. But how could we, as a task force, when governments in Europe are implementing various forms of complementary protection already, when the government of Mexico is implementing effectively a form of complementary protection with respect to a wider definition of people who are fleeing. If governments around the world are doing that, how could we as a task force say the United States should not move forward on that? And I think 20 years from now, if the administration hasn't moved on this, we will look back and say we've missed an enormous opportunity. And then finally, some of the measures on the migration side can be implemented without a legislation, at least in the near term. So that would be my answer to that question. But I invite members of the task force as well to comment on that.
I think climate change has acquired a certain political connotation in the US. But you see, even in places where there are a lot of climate deniers, growing concern about wildfires. We've got more wildfires, we've got more flooding. Sometimes it's just a question of vocabulary. I remember some of the mayors of Southern Florida cities saying, we don't talk about climate change, but boy, we can sure talk about flooding. Everybody understands that there's more flooding, there's more blue sky flooding. We've got to do something about flooding. So I think that there's probably more consensus out there about the need to do something about the changing climate than that's quite apart from the political polarization we see.
Okay, I'm gonna read the next question, and I don't have a task force member in mind, panel member in mind. So whoever wants to comment on this, but I think it's very relevant to this question is very relevant to how we actually frame the report, which is are climate finance organizations generally on board with supporting migration as a form of adaptation? If not, what do we see as their role? And that's a great question. And Kelly?
Yeah, I actually wrote my master's dissertation on this very question in 2012 and 2013. And back then, very much migration was seen as kind of a last resort measure, a negative outcome. But climate funds were already thinking about what that means for them and funding scenarios. We can actually see some progress today. We have the adaptation fund, for instance, that is very much digging deeply into this issue and very seriously taking into consideration planned relocation as an adaptation measure. And so there has been some movement in that regard. And I think it'll take a couple more years to really see how that shakes out funding wise, but there definitely is a movement towards understanding of migration as an adaptation strategy. The harder part is understanding what projects to build around that narrative. And I think planned relocation is one of those projects that's really tangible. And perhaps the next effort should be to understand what other ones would also qualify.
If I may just add to Kelly's point, I think there was a very early agreement within the task force of a couple of things. Number one, migration as an adaptation strategy, but also the importance of an integrated approach to dealing with this issue. The issue isn't prevention to the exclusion of migration or vice versa. And if there's a conceptual contribution, I hope there are more than one with the report, I think that's one of them, that this issue has to be dealt with in an integrated manner, hence the recommendation with respect to a global institution to deal with this issue. And I would only, Kelly's comment also makes me think of World Bank programs to promote support for refugees and host communities, and the discussion in the bank about more assistance to internally displaced communities to match the efforts of support to refugee communities in host countries. So, okay, let's see. Okay. Many of the impacted regions are those mainly comprised of low-income populations, as well as people of color. Is it accurate to also paint creating pathways for protection or strengthening pre-existing pathways, that is TPS and DED, as an issue of racial justice? I'm very eager to have members of the panel address this issue.
Yes, it is an issue of racial and climate justice. And I don't know if there needs to be a finer point on that. And I think Alex made that very cogent case earlier about the U.S.'s responsibility when it comes to this kind of justice.
I can also add that it's a question of intergenerational justice, where decisions made by my generation or my parents' generation are having dramatic effects on young people everywhere. I'm encouraged by the fact that young people are often in the forefront of movements to address climate change. This is an issue that affects their futures.
Anyone else on the panel? Okay.
Well, there's an excellent piece on this that a colleague wrote for the, I think it was the Tulane Law Review. I'll send a link in the chat and people can take a look at that, but I think it covers that topic very adequately. And I agree completely with Kaylee that this is a racial justice issue as much as anything else.
Here's a question that we've discussed a little bit, but it's presented in a more pointed way. So I think it's worth looking at. A key to success in this area may be a shared global responsibility for climate-induced cross-border migration. However, the current globally accepted refugee definition has no space for this category of movement. What must be done to change this perspective, and what is the probability of such a change, or does this change in categorization really matter? I'm inclined to point initially to Beth for a comment on this, but this conversation won't end without my saying something as well. Beth?
This has been a real theme. Are people climate change refugees? Should we change the 1951 Refugee Convention to admit people displaced by the effects of climate change? The refugee community is saying pretty much a resounding no that to reopen the convention is a Pandora's box. We might get even more restrictive measures, that it really confounds the notion of what is a refugee fleeing persecution and violence. That's why in our report, we call for complementary protection. You know, let's keep the refugee definition. There are some overlaps between people fleeing because of climate change and violence. UNHCR has put out some legal considerations. You know, there might be cases where a government discriminates against a certain ethnic group when it comes to disaster risk reduction measures that would qualify as persecution under the 1951 convention and therefore be admissible as a refugee. But developing complementary forms of protection, people who may not meet the legal requirements of the definition, but who face danger or death if they are returned home. And we've gotten some recent support on that from the UN Human Rights Committee, saying people should not be returned to places where their lives can be threatened, not only by torture or by violence, but by the effects of climate change. So I think, you know, the consensus, at least among the refugee advocates, is let's develop more nuanced ways of dealing with this population rather than calling them climate change refugees or reopening the convention. But Eric, I'm sure you've got views on this as well. Everybody does.
Everybody does. All right, I'll offer some thoughts. First of all, this issue is dealt with extensively in the report, and kudos to Kaylee and her team and to the task force. And let me emphasize at the outset, because I know this has been a major concern, a major issue that we not neglect, that was articulated by IRAP, which is we should see this as an opportunity also to recognize that convention refugees can well come under, those who are affected by climate can well come under the refugee convention and protocol definition. And UNHCR has recently issued an important paper on that very same subject. And so the report urges the administration to train adjudicators, to have this degree of sensitivity. But having said that, as a former U.S. government official, we often could have walked around thinking that, we were in the lead on everything. But sometimes we're not. And in fact, maybe often we're not. And in this area of complementary protection, I think other parts of the world are well ahead of the United States. The Cartagena Declaration, which is a declaration but is being implemented in one manner or another in a majority of countries in Latin America, recognizes that people have legitimate reasons to flee and to obtain protection, that may be outside the 1951 Refugee Convention and the 67 Protocol. And this is being implemented. We're about to issue a report on Tuesday that talks about Mexico's efforts to seriously implement the provisions of Cartagena, which would have serious implications for those, could have serious implications for those displaced by climate. African governments have adopted, have endorsed the concept of an expanded definition of those who need protection. And European governments have what they call subsidiary protection. So the notion that we're recommending something for the United States to do that nobody has ever done, that this it's just not true. We would be a follower on this issue, but we ought to be a leader. We ought to be a leader on this. All right. Anyone else on this subject? All right. Okay. I'm going to ask another question, which is right in front of me. What are the gendered impacts of climate-induced migration, and does that impact or change the recommendations? I'll let members of the panel sort of reflect on that for a second.
Alex, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask for. Now I see it in the posted questions, and so I think that the closer to one gets to the ground, the more these issues really matter, and they're fundamentally significant to the way communities adapt to climate change. And so there's no question that gender is going to play a critical role to localization of both climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. Beyond that, I don't know that we could have gone into a lot more depth without making the report twice or three times as long to address those issues. But maybe Kaylee has some thoughts on that as well.
I think Beth did first, actually, so I'll let Beth go.
Yeah, I mean, the research seems to show that the dominant effect is that, you know, when environmental conditions get bad, men go off to work in the cities, women stay home or left behind with the kids, changing in gender roles and consequences. But that isn't always the case. In some situations of environmental hazards, the women and kids go off and the man stays home. You know, so there are changing gender effects of climate change, changes on livelihoods that affect gender roles and perceptions. So, I mean, I think gender plays a huge role in this household decisions about who migrates, when, for how long, who stays home. I think we devote too much attention to those who move versus those who are left behind. So the so-called immobile, whether voluntarily or involuntarily immobile, it's a mouthful, but you know, just to deal with people who I don't know, a decade ago, the Foresight report referred to as trapped populations, to really look at the impact of migration, not just on those who move or the communities that receive them, but those who can't or won't or decide not to move.
Maybe I want to jump in on this a little bit, Eric. I want to speak not just to the gender issue here, but I think to the larger developmental issue. You know, I think we have the, you know, sustainable development goals. We have the Millennium Development Goals previously, and we have approaches to trying to address development issues, both long and short term. But I think what's so critical about this report is that it's taking a different lens to a lot of these kind of issues that people have been talking about for a while, and saying that there's a whole layer of issues around climate change and migration that we have not actually looked at. And I think, again, I want to make an analogy to a lot of the health programs. And there's been a lot of, I think, for example, with Global Fund and HIV/AIDS would be one example where there was the creation of a multilateral essentially institution to address, you know, HIV/AIDS, malaria, and TB. And really, it took that type of focusing on the issue to really begin to address all of the different pieces of it. So I think, from my perspective, one, that the task force, the U.S. government's leadership, and also what's going on needs a little bit more focus in terms and amplification, so that we can begin to address these issues very specifically. I think the second thing I wanted to mention is that, you know, as we look at local communities and how they're responding, there's a lot of parts to that where people don't have choices. And I think oftentimes we don't realize that. So the whether to migrate or not migrate, it's been mentioned several times already, is a very personal choice, but it's also one that has to be based on a lot of the factors around them and essentially the pressures that they're under and dealing with. So from my perspective, you know, again, I want to keep focus on, one, the international community and trying to make sure that we bring much more attention and amplification to these issues. And secondly, remembering that these are really locally felt and dealt with, and we need to actually address them from a local perspective. And I think the international community hasn't always been good at that. We're really good at creating big structures, and we're really good at getting people like us around the table to talk about things. Where we haven't been good is actually getting really hearing the voices on the ground and really empowering them, and then really resourcing those conversations. So thanks.
Thank you, Rick and others. We're getting some really provocative questions here, and we're not going to be able to address all of them, but I'd like to try to address as many as we can. The latest one, and don't worry for those who asked earlier, I'm keeping an eye on everything we haven't answered yet, so I'm going to try to get back to everything. Simple question. At what point does non-refoulement, traditionally under the Refugee Convention, that's forced return to persecution, but it has other other meanings as well. At what point does non-refoulement extend to climate displaced persons? I mean, I suppose I could take an initial try at that answer. You know, I think I think I think it's probably fair to say that the task force perspective is that it should, that if we are making a recommendation, that you know that dire circumstances create threats that justify protection, that those dire circumstances, which could include you know, climate-induced or climate-affected disaster, should similarly, if we're talking about protection of those who are seeking protection, then we're also talking about a protection from return. And you know, we have the report talks about judicial and quasi-judicial decisions that use the concept of refoulement really beyond the refugee convention, as it should. And so I think consistent with the thrust of the recommendations and the thrust of the report, you know, I think if we're arguing for increased protection, you know, from receiving countries for climate displaced persons, then that protection should extend to non-return. It seems pretty clear to me. But I'd invite other members of the panel to comment on that.
I think we included that as one of our recommendations that, you know, when people can't return because of the effects of climate change, that should be considered, and the administration should consider using its parole authority in those cases to prevent people from being sent back to places where their lives are in danger. I mean, I think it's kind of a natural extension.
Yeah, and yeah, and the parole authority also as an option in the absence of legislation on complementary protection. Here's a question that's actually let me ask a question we got several minutes ago. Major polluting countries like the US and the EU are responding to climate migration by fortifying and militarizing their borders rather than addressing their role in climate change. Why is there not more attention being paid to the relationship between those creating climate migrants at the same time as they're keeping them out?
It's a great question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. I mean, we live in pluralistic democracies where we're going to have multiple voices speaking, and sometimes the voices of intolerance and you know, someone else raised the question of how do we make the recipient communities more willing to receive and embrace those who come from climate affected regions. And these are, you know, we would all wish that that there would be more of a spirit of embrace and a recognition of responsibility, but that's not widely shared. And so I think it's something we just have to recognize as part of a pluralistic democracy. So that's a punt really, but I thought I'd add that.
You know, I think that sometimes climate activists, certainly about a decade ago, would often use the specter of mass migration as a consequence, almost as a threat. You know, if you rich countries don't reduce your emissions, 1 million people are going to show up on your border. You know, I think that was probably a poor strategy. You know, seeing migrants as a problem and a result of. Anyway, but this whole issue of linking obligations to responsibility, I think rich countries find that really abhorrent. You know, even if the US recognizes its role in contributing to carbon emissions, to say somehow that obliges us to take people who are displaced by the effects. I think it's a very hard argument to make politically, although morally it certainly has a lot of resonance. It's difficult for governments to draw those connections into policies.
I don't think I can answer why the issue isn't a source of debate. I mean, I think I can. I think Beth and Alex suggested why it's not an issue of debate within countries of the global north. But I will say that this kind of issue is has been the subject of discussion, research, and commentary within the international humanitarian community. And it goes to the question of how do we define responsibility sharing? And is responsibility sharing in the area of migration, countries of the global north being willing to take, some very modest numbers of refugees and other forced migrants through their refugee resettlement programs, provide significant and substantial resources to countries in the global south to host the overwhelming majority of refugees and other forced migrants. And that sort of deal, if you will, has been, has been subject to quite a bit of critical scrutiny, and those who have criticized it, myself included, have argued for a much fairer approach towards responsibility sharing, and so although the issue hasn't really become part of the political debate, within the United States or other countries of the global north, it is an issue that has been, debated within the international humanitarian community. And I think this report sort of nudges, I think has implications for that debate, and suggests, I think, a broader concept of international responsibility sharing. I see that we're running close to 3 o'clock, and I'm getting a text message saying that that's it with the questions. So I'm going to invite each member of the task force to offer any final comment that they'd like to offer before we close. And I'm going to, Beth, I'm going to start with you to invite you to say any final comments, and then we'll go around, and then we will thank everyone for joining us, and we'll break. Beth?
Thanks. I mean, I think this is an opportunity to really talk about some of the nuances of climate migration. It isn't an easy issue, I mean, because it's hard to define who is a climate migrant, given the multi-causal nature of most movements. But I think this opens the possibility for rich discussions among academics, NGOs, practitioners, local communities. So I think we've got a historic opportunity to talk about these things and hopefully come up with some better policies to respond. So thanks to Eric and all the task force, and to the Biden administration for launching this executive order.
Thank you, Beth. Alex?
Well, I don't have a lot more to add, but I think that the questions raised were very important, and I just say that it is an impressive effort on the part of the Biden administration. The issue is extremely complex. We see states failing around us, Haiti, potentially Cuba, nothing to do with climate change per se. And then you have this potential overlay of climate on issues around conflict and things like that. So my remarks stand. I think that this is an issue that's going to remain on the agenda and going to become more important in the future. And we do need to get ahead of that curve. And so I do applaud the Biden administration and this panel for taking on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Rick?
Well, just briefly want to thank everyone on the task force and on the panel today. I don't want to repeat what's been already said, but just appreciative that we are dealing with this issue. We're talking about it, and hopefully we could move it forward as we move forward ourselves. Thank you.
Kaylee?
Thank you. Just to end in a little bit of hope here, and to plug the recent Oxfam Sierra Club report that did a lot of work about narrative building and narrative framing around this issue. I think we're at a historic crossroads to really address this issue, right? And that opportunity may be highly politicized, but there are definitely avenues to depoliticize a bit this issue. And that report found that it simply boils down to intergenerational conversations. So by and large, younger people are much more attuned to climate change issues, understand justice and equity issues around migration. And if they have those tough conversations with their parents and grandparents who are a little more skeptical, they may be able to move the needle on that. And perhaps we can shift the Overton window a bit on this as well.
I just want to echo Kaylee's comments, which really echo comments were made by the task force throughout the process. This is a big challenge, but it's not an insurmountable challenge. And we have the resources to address it. And we just, the real outstanding issue is political will. But this is a manageable challenge. And the presentations by Alex throughout our task force meetings were, I think those presentations resulted in task force members saying, this is amenable to reasonable policy decisions. And that, I think really that's what the task force report is about. And we will continue as Refugees International in collaboration with our other organizations involved in the task force and beyond to advocate around the recommendations in this report. So thank you to members of the panel. Thank you to members of the task force, and thank you to all of those who have stayed for the hour. And we will look forward to engaging on this and other issues in the days, weeks, months, and years to come. Have a great rest of your day.